For decades, the European project felt like an inevitability, a continent moving steadily toward peace and prosperity through integration and enlargement. But today, that peace and prosperity are no longer a given. As the war in Ukraine grinds into its fifth year, Russia's imperial ambitions threaten to spill into other European countries too. Across the Atlantic, our oldest ally is turning towards nationalism and neo-imperialism. And to the Far East, China, as a rising superpower, offers a vision of the future fundamentally at odds with our own. All of this is unfolding against the backdrop of rising nationalism and far-right extremism in Europe, alongside an accelerating global climate crisis, a threat that ignores borders, strains our resources, and acts as a volatile multiplier for every other danger we face. In the face of these shifting tides, it is easy to believe that Europe's best days are behind it. But if you look past the headlines and toward the people, you see a very different story. The journey across the continent to find the truth about our past and present, and what hope we have for our future. We interviewed 15 scholars, politicians, thought leaders, and activists from the halls of academia to the front lines of civil society and industry to ask the hard questions, to understand the cracks in our foundations, and the solutions that could bridge them. What are the threats? How do we fix what is broken? And most importantly, why does Europe still matter? Before we can understand why Europe matters, we have to look at the challenges it faces, the sheer scale of the stakes. Our journey to find those answers begins with the intellectual foundations of Oxford University, moving through the financial engines of London and New York, before returning back to the European mainland and navigating the institutional corridors of Paris and Brussels. Finally, we finish in Warsaw, with those who live on the front line and truly understand the dangers that Europe is facing.
Do you want your personal safety to depend on the whims of Donald Trump and his America? Do you want your country to be attacked by Vladimir Putin's Russia? Do you want your job to depend on Xi Jinping and his China? If your answer to any or all of those questions is no, then you must want a stronger Europe, a Europe capable of standing up to these bullies.
Now, it seems to me that there are two possible models that the world may be shifting towards. One is a survival of the fittest, a law of the jungle, and essentially it is a world of either imperial competition or perhaps even imperial collusion. And by empire here, what I'm talking about is the United States of America as the first and foremost of the empires, but also, of course, Putin's Russia and Xi's China. Now, that particular scenario is one which basically sees Europe on the colonial menu.
This administration sees Europe not only weak and usually irrelevant, but worse, an enemy. I'll remind everyone that Donald Trump thought Brexit was a terrific idea, and a lot of the people in the administration actually want to promote movements in the EU to destroy it.
Ever since the end of the Second World War, we have had something which we've come to call the West, which means the United States and Canada working initially with Western Europe, now with most of Europe, as a single geopolitical actor, right? And when bad stuff happens, we try and counter it together. That's been sort of fraying since the end of the Cold War, but now with Donald Trump for the first time, we can't rely on it at all. Trump is actually better friends with strongmen like Putin and Mr. Erdogan in Turkey and Xi Jinping in China than he is with almost anyone in Europe, except his friend Viktor Orban in Hungary, right? So that's what we mean by the West no longer being there as a player, as an actor, and that's why Europe has to do more. We Europeans have to do more for ourselves.
This whole very exaggerated language that comes out of the Cold War, that comes out of the Atlanticism of the 20th century, it's dead. And it has been dying in the United States for at least a decade. And in a sense, Trump too is another opportunity to wake up, smell the coffee, recognize the fundamental change in relations. So I fundamentally disagree with the positioning of many of the European governments and much of the Brussels bureaucracy which has essentially adopted a fawning, sycophantic relationship to the United States. It's a crude thing to say, but I don't think that's the language that the Trump people understand. I think the language they understand is that of power and counterpower. And the Chinese demonstrated with their rare earth sanctions how effectively that can work. Europe needs to be considering what levers it can develop to have a similar effect. And the irony and the tragedy, of course, is we know that they had that. They were going to develop anti-coercion devices. There was an entire team that was in place earlier in 2025 that was set to apply counter-coercion tactics to Trump, and they bailed. So that, I think, is the fundamental will that we have to see developing in the national capitals, and it's the leading national capitals of Europe and Brussels together that have to take the lead on this. And there has to be a hill that they are willing to make a stand on.
If the US questions the very existence of the European Union as it is doing today in its national security strategy, we should be lucid. We should work on our own strategic autonomy. We should work on making sure we can stand on our 2 feet as a union and not become anyone else's sphere of influence. And in a military and defensive alliance that is NATO, one of the allies unilaterally attacks another ally by a hostile move on Greenland, to me this means the end of NATO. And this end of NATO, we would have a name written on it. It would be Donald Trump that would have ended the NATO alliance.
After 80 years, the United States is demolishing the global order which it built after 1945, and in which Europe found itself in a very privileged position because we could rely for our security and our prosperity on the US. And now Europe really has to rethink not just its policies, but its very mindset. And what Europe now needs to do is to rearm. To rearm militarily, in a standoff against Russia, for instance, but also to rearm intellectually. That is to equip ourselves with the concepts like strategy, interest, power, to survive and thrive in that much harsher new world which we are entering.
In a world of giants, Europe needs to be a giant itself.
For decades, European stability was a given, underpinned by global trade and distant alliances. But that era of certainty has ended, and nowhere is this new reality more visible than in European security. Europe now faces a stark choice: build its own strategic defences, or become a part of another nation's sphere of influence.
Russia is a real enemy, is a real threat to Europe, and the US is pulling away and is perhaps even a hostile power now in our vicinity. When we buy stuff, often the modern stuff is being bought from the United States, and that means there is really quite a bit of technological dependence on the US industrial base. And so the result is that we need to invest in our security, and that means investing into mass, but it also means investing into new technologies, modern technologies of warfare, such as used and successfully used in Ukraine.
What we have to do, however, is to create something that the Americans have and we don't have, the so-called strategic enablers. We are reliant on the US when it comes to satellites, airlift, command and control, all these things that cost a lot of effort, and we've been comfortable that we don't have to invest that money and we can use what the Americans have. These days are over. Russia also is watching how the United States will respond to this intimidation, because if the Kremlin thinks even for a moment that's no longer the case, then I can promise you that a Russian humanitarian convoy will travel from Belarus to Kaliningrad, closing the Suwalki Gap and saying that because there was a, terrorist attack in Kaliningrad, they have to secure part of Lithuania. The fear among security professionals is that Kaliningrad is going to be used to stage one of those false flag operations where Russia attacks itself in Kaliningrad and finds a pretext to move from Belarus through Lithuania to create an external corridor and effectively, by this, closing NATO ability to reach the Baltic states.
So first, economic power today needs defense power, military capacity, deterrence capacity. And this is a reality in a world where power is becoming more prevalent and where rivalry is the name of the game and where you've got big powers wanting to do spheres of influence. So if Europe does not want to become somebody else's sphere of influence, and I think that's what European citizens want, then deterrence is the name of the game.
The Europe of defense does not exist. It is very limited. The European Commission does not have any power in this field and is just trying now to use what it can use in terms of single markets of arms, to put it this way. So I really think we need to make a step back and think again. How do we want to organize ourselves in a field which is, of course, very sensitive, but where it is in our common interest, first of all, to be stronger, second, to finance our defense efforts at the lowest possible price. Then, of course, we need to think about the next phases and the fact that we need to defend ourselves together.
Important and tangible example that not many people have talked about is when I was in the Latvian parliament before the introduction of the euro, and we discussed the pros and cons of why Latvia should join the euro. There was a Latvian member of parliament telling me, you know why we really want to join the euro? We want to join the euro because of Russia. And my reply was, the euro doesn't really help you against Russian tanks. And the reply was, well, but it does help committing the rest of Europe to Latvia. And I think that's really right. I mean, if there was ever to be a physical attack on Latvia by Russia, it would have immediate consequences for the monetary stability of the Eurozone as a whole. It would not just be a Latvian issue, it would be an attack on our monetary sovereignty.
Here in Brussels, in the buildings we can see behind us, they like to work in silos. So you have your trade department, your industry department, and then on the other side of town, there's people doing security, or in Paris and in Berlin and Warsaw. In the world of today, these have to be brought together. And with the Brussels Institute for Geopolitics, we have put forward a proposal for a so-called Economic Security Council, a little bit modeled on what in the US, in Washington, they have with the National Security Council. That is to say, a body capable of taking these overarching decisions across silos and with the democratic legitimacy.
But NATO will continue to exist, I believe this strongly, and will continue to be the defense alliance for Europe.
But a continent cannot defend its values or its borders if it cannot defend its economy. In the 21st century, power is measured not just in military might, but also in capital, innovation, and technological sovereignty. Can Europe unlock its financial potential and keep pace in the growing global tech race?
So there is this very sticky notion that somehow the reason that the Europeans haven't managed to replicate the American success in creating these powerful tech companies is because the Europeans are so committed to digital regulation. That is a very, I would say, intellectually dishonest and an incorrect analysis of the problem. So the first issue is that there is no integrated digital single market in Europe.
Startups in Europe have a difficulty of raising the capital they need to grow in the European market, and they often therefore turn to the US markets for growth funding, and then in the process of it they actually become US companies and not European companies. So the idea of capital markets union is to say, okay, we need to boost a European market for funding of major investments. We need to have less fragmentation, meaning it needs to be easier to fund economic activities in different countries. So make it easier for a firm in Estonia to tap the capital market in Europe and not just the capital market in Estonia.
So my starting point is that European universities are top-notch. We don't have to blush. We are as competitive. Our researchers, innovators are top class. It's not about producing and generating the knowledge. By the way, in many other universities around the world, including in the US, including in China, the brains behind their innovation and creativity are very often European brains. So we don't have a problem of brains. We have a problem of translating the innovation they generate into market.
We have different laws across the 27 member states. The American market doesn't have that degree of diversity. We need to eradicate those barriers from within Europe that currently prevent the ability of European tech companies to take benefit of that scale. So, for one, Europeans are probably not going to win the race for developing the capital-intensive, energy-intensive large language models. But I'm not sure that's where the future is, and that's what the Europeans should even be trying to do. Where I really think that the Europeans' focus ought to be is AI applications. And there is no inherent advantage that Americans or Chinese have over Europeans in that. And that's where the productivity gains lie. We need to reduce our vulnerabilities from other tech vendors that can be weaponized against us Europeans. That means de-risking away from Chinese technology, but increasingly also de-risking away from American technologies. At the same time, that means we need to enhance our ability to build those technologies at home.
The issue of financing Europe's ambitions, I think, is the absolute core to what we should be focused on. Europe does have the money. It's a rich continent. The EU budget is not going to increase. The member states don't want it. The treaties are hard to amend. But the money is there. And particularly when we focus on the European Investment Bank, the money is there. When I was ambassador to the EU, I worked with the US Treasury, and we did some analyses which led us to conclude that by tweaking some of the policies of the European Investment Bank, the bank could come up with hundreds of billions of additional euros for financing. Well, tweaking perhaps is an exaggeration, but by increasing its gearing, its leverage, the amount of debt to its shareholders' equity, one could raise more money. By increasing the losses on its loan book, which are essentially zero today, one could also extend a lot more financing. The bank today is essentially not acting as a bank. It is taking no risk. I would argue it should be taking more risk.
Financial markets are gagging for high-quality European debt. How it's going to mobilize around the opportunity of issuing that debt to finance the investment that's necessary. And the obvious solution, and Europe again and again stumbles towards this conclusion, as it did over COVID, as it ultimately did over financing Ukraine's latest round of support, is common debt issuance, which then ultimately can be backed by European institutions, either pooled liability of European sovereigns, which gives it incredibly high debt ratings, or ultimately in the backstop of the ECB. And I think, to my mind, the fact that the ECB discourse has become less hot, less heated, less a matter of principle, more pragmatic, is a win.
So the Europeans are dealing with growing threats by the United States to say that, look, if you don't rein in your regulatory impulses and stop going after our tech companies, there will be tariffs. And we worry about Trump's trade barriers. Europe's most important trade partner is Europe. We need to eradicate those barriers from within Europe. According to the European Central Bank and the International Monetary Fund, the barriers, the internal barriers inside Europe amount to a tariff that is equivalent to 45 to 65%. When it comes to trade in services, those internal barriers are equivalent to 100% tariff. Those barriers are for us to remove.
Economic sovereignty isn't about winning trade wars, it's about clearing the path at home. To unleash that economic potential, Europe must re-evaluate how it does business, both with the outside world and with itself. While headlines keep focusing on the fear of foreign tariffs, those threats often blind us to the towering barriers of regulation. It's time to stop playing defence and rethink the true, untapped power of the European market.
In a world where nationalism and protectionism is becoming more prevalent, the EU has to rethink its strategy in three different ways. First, diversify your trading partners, which is why it's good that the European Union is concluding the trade agreement with the countries of Mercosur. Diversify means putting eggs in different baskets so that it's not too dependent on one. Number two in resilience is deepening its own internal market. The more we deepen our internal market, the less dependent we are on the volatilities.
Europe has a lot of leverage. It's true that China does not rate Europe, the EU specifically, as a military power, but believe me, China rates Europe as a very rich, open market where consumers buy Chinese products, especially now the US market is essentially closed. So Europe should use that significant leverage as a trading power to say, if you want to access our market, you have to change the way you go about business. We want you to invest more of your technology here, transfer that technology, not just bring Chinese workers to build gigafactories, employ more Europeans.
The other obvious direction to push in are the high-functioning, highly sophisticated democracies of East Asia. Korea, South Korea and Japan are partners anyone would want. They're highly sophisticated, democratic capitalist systems with huge technological potential, in some senses obvious partners for Europe, cooperating closely with Japan and South Korea to think about how one, for instance, approaches China. This is a far more promising sort of G20 multipolar vision of what a European power politics globally could look like. And it's certainly one which goes to the top and not to the bottom.
For decades, bringing new nations into the fold was a slow and very technical process of alignment. But that luxury is gone. As the world changes, so must the map of Europe. The war in Ukraine has stripped away all old illusions, transforming enlargement from a long-term economic project into an urgent geopolitical necessity. But we have to be honest, expanding the Union doesn't just mean adding names to a list. It requires reinventing the European project entirely.
Enlarging the European Union today is not just an economic project, it's not just expanding the internal market, it's not just a political project, uniting parts of the continent that are still not there. It's also a geopolitical project. It's making sure we don't have areas around the European Union or neighbors of the European Union that are placed under specific risks because they are neither in nor out. That is also enlargement today.
Saving Ukraine, making Ukraine a viable, strong, sovereign, independent country which can defend itself against Russia. And that's up to us in Europe. Number two, bringing this country, our country, Britain, back closer and closer to the European Union. Because if you want a strong Europe, you need Britain closer to it. It's increasingly clear to more and more people in Britain that this has been a disaster for this country. So for both of us, Britain and the rest of Europe, we have to get back together again.
The most important thing for me in all this is that the biggest mistake that can be done is try to defend the status quo that does not exist anymore. Any type of be it enlargement, be change in the European Union is going to mean reinventing the Union. Even if you're going to have the enlargement of the European Union, it's not going to be the same enlargement as it was, for example, with the Central European countries. And we're going to see deepening of integration in one areas and fragmentation in the others. And this is going to happen at one and the same time. Not simply Europe on different speeds, we are going to see Europe with different faces.
The map of power is shifting, and Europe must shift with it. In a post-Western world, we can no longer rely on old certainties, nor can we preach from a position of double standards. To lead in the 21st century, Europe must reinvent its role as a partner to the global South, trading the old habit of extraction for a new era of joint value creation.
As far as the global South is concerned, firstly, I think that we cannot escape talking about the Middle East and about Gaza in particular. This is now a conversation which is very conveniently set to one side in Europe. There is no peace in the Middle East. And what are commonly known as our double standards, our hypocrisy, our concern for Ukraine and our total disregard for Gaza remain absolutely critical today. Now, the conversation about double standards can be resolved in two possible ways. You can either say, well, you get rid of double standards by getting rid of standards altogether, and this is indeed what Trump's America represents, or you can get rid of double standards by actually subscribing and adhering and enforcing those standards. And therefore, rather than essentially believing that there is an illusion of peace that actually doesn't hold, there are certain instruments that Europeans can put to the table in terms of actually exerting pressure where violations are carried out. And here I'm particularly thinking about, for instance, the suspension of the trade component of the EU-Israel Association.
The approach can no longer be the extractive approach where Europe goes to the global south looking for minerals. These countries have their own legitimate industrial policy goals. These countries want to develop new industrial supply chains, want to create jobs and growth opportunities in their own countries. And the beauty is that Europe and many countries in the global south have a really complementary. For example, the only way for Europe to decarbonize the steel industry is to get direct reduced iron from African countries or other countries in the global south, import that into Europe, and then go to the final stages of production of steel with electric arc furnaces. There is no way we can produce this DRI in Europe. So Europe needs to partner with these countries. It's not about resource extraction, it's about joint value creation in these countries, and a lot of European companies want to make these investments.
Energy has become the new frontier of European freedom. None of our geopolitical ambitions matter on a planet in crisis, or in a union that cannot power itself. Leading the green transition is no longer just a moral choice, it's a strategic necessity. And to succeed, Europe must figure out how to build a sustainable future that actually lowers costs, strengthens our industries, and crucially, brings every community along for the journey.
So for Europe, the green transition is a necessity, dictated by our natural endowments. Unlike the United States or others in the world, Europe is an energy resource poor continent. We don't produce much oil, we don't produce much gas domestically. We need to import almost everything what we consume. This is a problem because it's expensive and because this import dependency exposes Europe to geopolitical volatility, as we have seen with the energy crisis after the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So the green transition, meaning the development of domestic renewable energy resources primarily, is for Europe the way forward to become more secure when it comes to energy, but also to become more competitive.
I'm absolutely convinced that we should not make a U-turn on the Green Deal because no one on Earth can stop climate change and biodiversity loss. So you can have discussion on how you tackle the issue, but you cannot deny. It is part of the future competitiveness of all countries. Look at what China is doing with greening. It is also a matter of resilience. You cannot have just a look on defense, but at the same time you are completely vulnerable because of water scarcity or floods or fire or impact on your value chain. And I must confess that for me, the worst part of the agenda of the far right is to deny all these problems, to be in a state of denial on climate change, on nature loss, which is very strange for people who pretend to be conservatives, because they should wish to conserve, to preserve what our countries are, and with climate change they will be destroyed, not least the vineyards, for example. So that's the reason why I think we have excellent arguments to fight their positions. And as Goethe wrote in the Faust, to be in a state of denial is the sign of evil. I mean, you cannot discuss with people who are denying what is true.
One of the latest nature studies has shown that around the world, 89% of the population wants stronger climate action. It's not at all what we are seeing on our screens, on political speeches. It's not reflecting that. So the backlash that we are seeing, not only in the EU, but across the world, is not representing the worrying of citizens. Citizens across the world and across the EU are still very deeply worried about EU climate action. So if we want to solve the environmental backlash that we are facing today, The answer is climate justice. It means a just transition. It means taking into account in every single policy the social differences of every citizen across the EU to make sure that they are taken into account inside the environmental policies.
Climate is the one thing on which actually Europe had something to say. It had a vision. It was recognized as a climate leader, and there is absolutely no reason, other than basically self-inflicted pain, why we should be backtracking from this.
Personally, I find it hard to see China's highly effective investment program, industrial policy in support of a green energy revolution as anything other than a gift for humankind. We should have done it. The extraordinary thing is they did it at huge scale, and when you add it up, when you look at the numbers that people produce, they're actually far from overwhelming. China isn't, at the local level, a very rich country. Nevertheless, Chinese provincial governments, which are the size of European nation states, mustered resource, did all the obvious things, concerted industrial policy, and produced a green energy revolution. Europe should do the same.
As our workforce shrinks and our industries evolve, the maths of the old Europe no longer adds up. To fuel this new economy and adapt to demographic shifts, Europe must face the reality of its borders. We have spent years debating migration as a hypothetical future threat, but it is a present reality, and if managed with vision, a crucial opportunity to infuse our aging continent with the human capital and innovation it needs to compete.
Fundamentally, the thing to understand is that migration is a reality in Europe. We talk about it as though it was a hypothetical, a threat, a future prospect. That was the past. I mean, I moved to Germany in the early 70s when the foreigner share was in the single digits. Germany today is a society with 1/3 of its population either foreign or of migrant background, having one parent who migrated to Germany from outside Germany. That is a level which is comparable to New York in the early 20th century. It is a spectacular exercise in diversity, mixing, complexity, and it's one that demands and really is a huge opportunity for investment in human capital. And we know in so many European cities, diverse societies, even if we don't want to speak the old language of multiculturalism, de facto, extraordinarily diverse societies flourish, they rub along, they get by. It is not a society, unlike the J.D. Vance rhetoric, endlessly racked by extremism and race riots, right? That's actually much closer to the reality of the United States.
As I see it, the world is suffering from three interconnected crises. The first is a crisis of democracy, an increasing gap between the representatives and the represented. The second is a crisis of social justice, an economic system that delivers only for a few people but doesn't deliver for the many, and in which the repercussions of those failures of social justice are then blamed on migrants, on vulnerable people, on those who are perceived not to belong. Borders are actually have never been more open for rich people and more closed for poor people, which is to say that borders are not a problem as such, because in the same weeks in which Donald Trump, for example, was posting videos of migrants in shackles, he was also at the same time opening America for European investors. And that is the approach of the right overall to migration, is to enable the rich to become naturalized very easily and to become punitive on the poor. The third is a failure of international solidarity, so a system in which international institutions are no longer able to have a vision for development that can satisfy both the most vulnerable citizens of rich states, but also vulnerable countries.
The European Union and Poland, of course, opened the labor market for Ukrainians, because today it is estimated that 75% of Ukrainians work. The Ukrainians today bring, depending on the estimates, 3 to 5 times more in taxes into the Polish budget than they take away in benefits and healthcare system. So they not only pay for what they take out of the system, but they bring more into the budget, generating anything between 0.2 to even 2%, some estimates show, of GDP in the last 3 years.
That returns us to a conception of citizenship was once upon a time something that was only for the wealthy few who could speak the national language, who had property to show, and the battles for democratizing citizenship were campaigns that tried to open up citizenship and consider it a vehicle of universal inclusion. And we need to go back to those debates, to go back to a conception of citizenship as a vehicle of political emancipation and not to citizenship understood in this ethnocentric and classist way.
What Europeans have not done successfully is that they have not replicated the tremendous success of Americans in attracting the global talent. So over 50% of over $1 billion startups in the US have an immigrant founder. America is becoming a very hostile place for immigrants. So my question is whether Europeans are the ones that are now rolling out the red carpet and saying, come to us.
True resilience starts at home, and yet the greatest threat to the European project might not be a foreign army. It's the fraying of our own social fabric. As the wealth gap widens, leaving entire communities behind, the promise of a shared prosperity has begun to vanish. This inequality has fueled a surge of populism that challenges the very foundations of our cooperation. To save the project, we must look past the rhetoric and address the source, a system that must start working for the many, not just the few.
I can't think of another moment in the last 80 years where really extreme anti-liberal, xenophobic, nationalist, populist parties have been so strong in so many countries right across Europe, from one end to the other. And the reason they're so strong is that a lot of people in our countries are very unhappy about the way their lives have been going over the last few years. And so the best answer is to do better on the things that really matter to people. So these countries may be blaming it all on the immigrants, right? But actually a lot of this is about building affordable housing, or getting good jobs, or reforming our welfare states, doing stuff that really matters to people. And so my answer is, like Nike, just do it. We have to deliver on the things that really matter to people.
We should try to understand why these ideas have such a success. On the one hand, there is something very easy in being nationalist. You give the people an identity message, but it is very basic, and we already experienced what the Europe of nations is. The Europe of nations was Europe that brought us to the First and the Second World War. Don't put the blame on voters, try to convince them that it is not a solution. And in my opinion, the pro-European camp is much too weak. If the project of the so-called moderate parties within the European Union is to be just a little bit less nationalistic than the others, if you are just a small step behind the extreme right, they will win. And it is what we observe everywhere.
What we are seeing, particularly in Europe, as globalization of the right wing. In a certain way, many of the nationalistic parties in Europe are the new globalists. And on the other side, many of the mainstream parties suddenly discovered the charm of sovereignism.
If we say that each country in the world needs to have a project of making their country great again, well, the world is not such that it can contain all countries making each other great again. And so we return to a world of war and instability where each of us tries to make ourselves great again, but somehow this does not result in a balance of countries and in a distribution and in a justification of power from a global perspective that is more acceptable. So we need to think about the contradictions of migration as contradictions of globalization.
We've looked at the cracks and we've mapped the threats, but it would be a mistake to end on a note of doom and gloom. In every city we visited, from Oxford to Warsaw, Helsinki to Paris, we have found people searching for and already building the answers. There is a lot to be hopeful about if you know where to look. So let's see what gives our experts hope for the future.
I worked at the beginning of my career with a former president of the European Commission, Jacques Delors. And he used to say, never choose between being an optimist or a pessimist. The only choice you can make is to be an activist. What gives me hope is that I see millions of Europeans ready to be activistic to ensure Europe has its own place in the world and Europe writes its own future.
So what gives me hope is literally every single EU citizen. The organization of EU citizens beyond borders with strong projects that are today showing to the rest of EU citizens that we can have amazing farms respecting their lands, we can have amazing schools with different types of educations, and we can have amazing filmmakers making super beautiful movies about the world of tomorrow. There are so many projects going on right now. Even we could say too many projects that are inspiring us on a daily basis. Now we have to support them. It's so beautiful to see that we can have a common vision from Poland to Italy to Spain, and that together we are trying to focus on how do we imagine the EU together tomorrow.
Because I meet a lot of young people. I've been an investor. I know the talent that is here, the rich talent that is here. If Europe can manage to convince more of its young, its new generation, that there's an opportunity in Europe, and if Europe can manage to divert even some of the hundreds of billions that are flowing to the United States to invest in Europe, if Europe can finally move on some of the core issues such as the capital markets union and perfect the single market, a huge amount can be done. And finally, if Europe can invest in the key technologies of the future, Europe will have a strong future.
Europe has seen multiple different crises in the last 2 decades, from the migratory crisis to Brexit, from Russian war to the weakening of the transatlantic link. And every time, Europe starts to do more together, not less.
Hope is important on its own because hope is basically what Europe was based on. And the fact that basically Europe in its history has survived a much bigger moment of crisis than this one gives me probably not the hope, but the expectations that we can do it once again.
And fundamentally what animates that optimism is that we know, I think, that the vast majority of people in the world would be delighted, would love to be able to live in societies organized like Europe. If you didn't know where you were going to be born and you ended up with that passport, you would consider yourself astonishingly fortunate. This is a successful model, a profoundly successful model.
We are a group of rich, educated societies with long traditions of liberal democracy. We have the capacities to face the threats that we're confronting. We have the capacity to the extent to which we summon the courage to actually move forward. So to me, it's more of a psychological state of mind that needs to shift rather than an actual building of instruments and means and capacities. Of course, all of that should be done, but it's that psychological switch which is necessary. At the moment is not happening. But if it happens, and I think it can happen, all the rest, I'm not saying it's going to be a walk in the park, but it's certainly going to be absolutely feasible to achieve.
We haven't even begun to look at what Europe can accomplish if it really unites its skills, its resources, its capabilities. So that gives me a lot of, not just hope, but a lot of faith, is that there's so many unexploited opportunities that we have failed to seize. Imagine for a moment that we harness our joint resources, our joint ambitions, and our joint confidence, and channel that into European solutions. There is nothing that we can't achieve.